3 days after burying her husband beneath a stone cairn on the windswept coast of Iceland, Thurid faced a choice that was not really a choice at all. Her brother-in-law stood in the doorway of what had been her home for 12 years, flanked by 2 witnesses from the local assembly. He spoke the formal words required by law, claiming his deceased brother's property, livestock and widow in a single transaction. Thurid could accept this arrangement and remain in her home as her brother-in-law's wife, or she could refuse and lose everything she had built, nurtured, and called her own. Viking inheritance law made no provision for a woman's independent survival. When her husband died, his widow became another asset to be transferred, her fate determined not by her own wishes, but by the legal obligations that bound families together and reduced women to property that moved between male hands. Viking law treated widows as transferable property. The legal codes that governed Viking Age Scandinavia, most comprehensively preserved in Iceland's Grágás and Norway's earlier regional laws, established clear hierarchies of inheritance that prioritized male lineage above all other considerations. When a man died, his property passed to his male heirs according to strict formulas that calculated relationship proximity through paternal bloodlines. Sons inherited first, then brothers, then more distant male relatives. Women appeared in these inheritance schemes only as temporary caretakers, or more commonly as property themselves, subject to transfer along with land, livestock and household goods. A married woman held no independent legal standing. Her person and possessions belonged to her husband during his lifetime, reverting to his family upon his death. The concept of a widow maintaining autonomous control over the household she had managed, the children she had raised, or the wealth she had helped accumulate found no support in Viking legal tradition. The laws assumed that women required male guardianship, and that the most efficient way to provide this protection while preserving family wealth was to transfer the widow to another male relative. The practice known as levirate marriage functioned as the primary mechanism for this transfer. Upon a man's death, his brother or closest male relative gained the right and often the obligation to marry the widow. This arrangement kept property within the family line, preventing wealth from dispersing through a widow's potential remarriage to an outsider. It provided the widow with continued access to resources, though at the cost of her autonomy, and it ensured that any children from the first marriage remained under family control, their labour and future value preserved for the paternal lineage. Saga literature preserves the emotional and social reality of this system through stories that treat widow inheritance as an accepted practice. In Laxdæla Saga, when Olaf Peacock dies, the text matter-of-factly describes the division of his property and the reassignment of household members, including dependent women, to male relatives. The saga writers treated widow transfer as a natural consequence of death, notable only when it generated conflict between competing male claimants. This system was presented as protection, but was it really? Subscribe, because in upcoming videos we'll explore other historical oppression systems disguised as protection. The brothers' claim created impossible situations. The mechanics of widow inheritance created situations that modern readers recognize as profoundly coercive, but that Viking legal thinking framed as protection and provision. When a man died, his brother gained first claim to the widow, superseding even the deceased husband's sons if they had not yet reached majority. This prioritization reveals the system's underlying logic, maintaining property within the generation rather than passing it down to potentially young and vulnerable heirs. For widows, this system meant facing a new husband chosen not by affection or compatibility, but by accident of kinship. The brother-in-law who gained rights to a widow might be decades older or younger than she was. He might already have a wife, creating a household where the widow entered as a secondary spouse with ambiguous status. He might be someone the widow actively disliked or feared, someone who had demonstrated hostility during the first marriage or harbored resentments that would now find expression in the intimate context of a forced union. The compulsory nature of these arrangements eliminated the possibility of genuine consent. A widow could theoretically refuse, but refusal carried consequences so severe that most women had no realistic alternative. To refuse meant forfeiting all claim to the property she had helped maintain during her marriage. It meant losing her home, the roof over her head, and the hearth where she had raised children. It meant abandoning any wealth she had brought as dowry, any goods she had produced through her labour, and any livestock she had tended. For a woman with minor children, refusal meant watching those children remain with their paternal family while she departed with nothing, severing the daily maternal bond that had structured her life. Economic realities left women without options. The Viking Age economy operated on principles that made female economic independence nearly impossible. Land, the primary source of wealth and security, passed through male inheritance lines exclusively. Women could not own land in their own right except under extraordinary circumstances, and even then they required male guardians to conduct legal transactions. A widow who refused her brother-in-law's claim found herself in a precarious economic position that would only deteriorate over time. She might initially seek refuge with her birth family, returning to her father's or brother's household. But this return represented a burden on kin who had already transferred her to another family through her first marriage. Her presence, especially if she brought dependent children, strained resources and created obligations that her male relatives might resent. Over time, a returned widow became an increasingly unwelcome dependent, her position eroding as years passed. Some widows attempted to establish independent households, surviving through textile production, brewing, or other domestic crafts. But these independent women occupied vulnerable positions, lacking the protection that connection to a powerful male kinsman provided. They faced higher risks of theft, assault, and exploitation, with limited legal recourse when wronged. The assemblies that adjudicated disputes operated through systems of male representation, requiring women to find male advocates willing to plead their cases. Women couldn't own land, conduct legal transactions, or even keep their own children. Do you think we still see remnants of this in the modern world? The children of the first marriage complicated the widow's situation further. Under Viking law, children belonged to their father's lineage, not their mother's. When a man died, his children remained with his family, their guardianship passing to male relatives. A widow who refused to marry her brother-in-law abandoned not just property, but her daily relationship with her children. She might see them occasionally, but she would lose her role in their upbringing, her influence over their futures, and her place in their daily lives. For many mothers, this separation proved a more powerful coercion than any economic threat. Imagine being forced to accept marriage coercion just to see your children. Keep watching, because you'll also see how some women resisted this system. Social pressure reinforced legal compulsion. Beyond formal legal structures, Viking communities maintained powerful informal mechanisms that pressured widows into compliance. The tight-knit nature of Viking Age settlements meant that everyone's business became community knowledge. A widow who resisted her brother-in-law's claim faced not just his displeasure, but the judgment of neighbours, extended family, and community leaders who viewed her resistance as disruptive and improper. Reputation mattered profoundly in Viking society, where honour operated as a form of social capital. A woman who gained a reputation for being difficult or disrespectful toward her deceased husband's family damaged not just her own standing but potentially that of her natal kin as well. Her father and brothers might face questions about why they had raised a daughter who refused to fulfill her obligations. This broader familial impact created additional pressure on widows to accept whatever arrangements their husband's family proposed. Religious beliefs reinforced these social pressures by sanctifying family structures and male authority. Both pagan and Christian religious frameworks emphasized duty, loyalty, and acceptance of one's ordained place in the social hierarchy. A woman who resisted widow inheritance could be portrayed as violating not just human law but divine order. Though the specific theological arguments differed between pagan and Christian contexts, both systems provided ideological justification for male control over female fate. Resistance existed but rarely succeeded. Despite the overwhelming forces that compelled widows into accepting inheritance marriages, some women attempted to resist. The saga literature preserves stories of widows who negotiated, delayed, or found creative ways to avoid unwanted marriages, though these stories typically frame such resistance as exceptional and often depict it ending in failure. One strategy involved immediate remarriage to a man of the widow's choosing before her brother-in-law could formally stake his claim. By moving quickly in the chaotic period following a death, a widow might secure a new marriage that superseded the inheritance claim. This tactic required advanced planning, a willing male partner already identified, and enough social capital to make the rapid marriage appealing. Most widows lacked these prerequisites. Some widows employed more subtle forms of resistance, accepting the marriage formally while making the arrangement so unpleasant that the brother-in-law eventually agreed to alternative terms. A woman who proved consistently difficult, who managed household affairs poorly, who created conflict with other family members, might persuade her new husband that keeping her was more trouble than her economic value warranted. This strategy risked backfiring, as an angry husband might respond with violence. The most extreme form of resistance involved fleeing, abandoning the household entirely and seeking refuge elsewhere. Saga accounts mention women who disappeared rather than submit to unwanted marriages, though the texts typically frame such flight as shameful and the women's fates as grim warnings. A fugitive widow faced all the vulnerabilities of an independent woman magnified by her outlaw status. Most women who fled likely ended up in circumstances worse than the marriages they escaped. Fleeing was the most desperate form of resistance. But if you were in these women's shoes, which path would you choose? Was there really a choice? Let's discuss in the comments. The system's cruelty multiplied through repetition. For women who outlived multiple husbands, the widow inheritance system created spiraling degradation, moving them from man to man within a kinship network until they either died or became too old to be worth inheriting. A woman widowed young might expect to be passed from her first husband's brother to, upon that brother's death, another male relative, and so on through a succession of marriages that had nothing to do with her choices or well-being. The saga literature preserves examples of women who married multiple times, though the texts often obscure whether these remarriages resulted from widow inheritance or other mechanisms. More representative are the brief mentions of women who appear in genealogical passages identified only by their successive marriages, their individual identities subsumed into their roles as links in male lineages. Age provided no protection from the inheritance system. An elderly widow might still be claimed by an elderly brother-in-law or even passed to a nephew, her value residing not in sexual or reproductive capacity, but in her labour, her knowledge of household management, and whatever property remained attached to her person. The sagas occasionally mention old women living in dependent positions in households managed by much younger relatives, their presence explained through these chains of inheritance marriage. A woman could be inherited 3, 4, even 5 times. Can you imagine this reality? If you enjoy this type of historical content, don't forget to subscribe. We share women's hidden stories from history every week. For widows with property or status that made them particularly valuable, the inheritance system could spark conflicts between competing male claimants. Brothers might dispute which of them had the superior claim. These disputes, conducted in assemblies and sometimes escalating to violence, treated the widow as a prize to be won, rather than a person with interests in the outcome. A widow caught between competing claimants existed in limbo, her fate dependent on legal arguments and power dynamics she could not influence. The archaeological record confirms legal texts. While saga literature and legal codes provide written evidence of the widow inheritance system, archaeological findings offer physical confirmation of how Viking Age inheritance patterns treated women as transferable property. Burial practices and skeletal analyses reveal social structures consistent with the legal subordination of women and their circulation among male-headed households. Viking Age cemeteries show distinct patterns in how men and women were buried that reflect their different legal statuses. Male burials frequently include weapons, indicating their role as warriors and independent legal actors. Female burials more commonly contain domestic implements, jewelry, and textile tools that identify them primarily through their household functions. The richness of grave goods correlates strongly with the woman's family connections, rather than any indication of her personal achievements. Women buried in their husband's family plots, rather than their natal family's plots, demonstrate the permanent transfer that marriage represented. A widow who remarried her brother-in-law and eventually died in that second marriage would be buried among her first husband's kin, her body joining property that had moved between brothers during her lifetime. Skeletal analysis of Viking Age remains has revealed patterns of trauma and stress that disproportionately affect female skeletons in ways consistent with their legal vulnerability. Female remains demonstrate higher rates of certain injuries associated with domestic violence and lower overall health indicators suggesting nutritional deprivation. These patterns align with written evidence that women existed as dependents whose access to resources depended on male relatives' willingness to provide adequate support. Christian conversion changed little initially. The gradual Christianization of Scandinavia between the 10th and 12th centuries might seem to offer hope for improvement in widows' circumstances, as Christian doctrine included teachings about marriage as a consensual union. In practice, however, Christian conversion did little to immediately alter the widow inheritance system. The Church adapted to existing social structures rather than transforming them. Christian marriage theology emphasized the importance of consent and the permanence of the marriage bond, principles that should have precluded forced remarriage of widows. But medieval Christian practice included its own coercive elements. The Church taught that remarriage of widows, while permitted, was spiritually inferior to maintaining chaste widowhood, yet it provided no economic mechanisms to support women who chose celibate independence. Christian widows thus faced the same economic pressures that had compelled pagan widows to accept inheritance marriages. In Iceland, where Christianity arrived in 1000 CE through political compromise, property and inheritance law remained largely continuous with pagan tradition. Christian authorities recognized that disrupting established inheritance practices would destabilize the economic foundations of society. Christian Iceland retained inheritance structures that treated widows as transferable property, justifying this continuity through interpretations of Christian teaching that emphasized family hierarchy and male household authority. Gradual change did eventually occur, as church courts gained jurisdiction over marriage disputes and Christian concepts of individual spiritual worth slowly percolated through Scandinavian society. By the later medieval period, widows had had gained marginally more legal autonomy. But these improvements took centuries to materialize and remained incomplete. Even Christianity couldn't change this system immediately. Did religion save women, or just bring a different form of oppression? What do you think about this controversial topic? The silence of women's voices. One of the most striking aspects of researching Viking widow inheritance is the near-total absence of women's own perspectives on the system. The legal codes that govern their lives were written by men, adjudicated by men, and enforced by men. The sagas that purport to preserve their stories were composed by male authors, shaped by male perspectives, and filtered through centuries of male scribal transmission. A few runic stones erected by or for women hint at the emotional reality behind the legal structures. Some widows commission memorial stones for deceased husbands that include expressions of grief, though whether these represent genuine emotion or required performance remains impossible to determine. The Eddic poetry and skaldic verse that survive include female characters who express strong emotions, but these literary creations cannot be taken as documentary evidence of real women's thoughts. This silence compounds the injustice inherent in the inheritance system. Not only did widows lack legal autonomy and economic independence, but their experiences of that subordination went largely unrecorded, their protest unheard, their strategies for resistance or accommodation lost to history. The actual voices of Viking widows facing inheritance claims remain forever silent, their subjective experiences accessible only through careful, speculative reconstruction. The legacy demands recognition. Understanding widow inheritance as a property transfer rather than a protection mechanism requires setting aside the explanations that Viking legal texts themselves offer. The laws claim to protect widows by ensuring they have male guardians to manage their affairs. Modern analysis recognizes these claims as ideological cover for a system that benefited men through control of female labor, sexuality, and reproductive capacity. This historical understanding carries implications beyond academic interest in Viking Age Scandinavia. The same legal logic that allowed Viking brothers to inherit widows appeared in various forms across many historical societies and persists in modified versions today in cultures that restrict women's legal autonomy. Recognizing the coercive nature of Viking widow inheritance helps illuminate the mechanisms through which patriarchal societies maintain control over female fate. The archaeological and textual evidence serves as a reminder that historical women's apparent choices often resulted from impossibly constrained circumstances. When saga literature mentions a widow remarrying her brother-in-law without noting resistance, modern readers should recognize the likely coercion behind that apparent consent. When legal codes describe procedures for widow transfer without recording women's objections, we should understand that silence is evidence of powerlessness rather than agreement. Consider the legal logic that transformed a woman from wife to inherited property in the days following her husband's death. Consider the brother-in-law who claimed his deceased brother's widow alongside the livestock and land, treating all as equivalent assets to be managed. Consider the widow herself, mourning her husband while facing the immediate reality that her grief period would last only until his brother appeared at her door with his legal claim. The widow inheritance system reduced women to fungible resources, interchangeable units that move through family networks based on male calculations about property preservation. Understanding this reduction matters, both for accurate historical knowledge and for recognizing how thoroughly societies can naturalize the commodification of human beings when those being commodified lack the power to resist or even to record their own stories of subordination and survival. This system existed 1,000 years ago, but in some countries women still can't conduct legal transactions without a male guardian. We must know the past to prevent history from repeating. Do you know which countries still have similar systems? Share your research in the comments and share this video to spread awareness of this important topic.